Montana Territory, 1879. A cold wind howled across the open plains, rattling the windows of Zane Whitfield's small cabin nestled in the shadow of the Bitterroot Mountains. At 25, Zane had already lived enough hardship for 3 lifetimes. His calloused hands moved methodically as he stoked the dying embers in his hearth, the golden light casting harsh shadows across his handsome but stern face. The soft lines around his eyes betrayed a man who once knew how to smile, though those moments had grown increasingly rare. "Another night, just me and you," he muttered to his cattle dog, Rusty, who lay curled by the fire. The dog lifted his head momentarily, then settled back down with a sigh that seemed to echo the emptiness of the cabin. Zane had come to Montana 3 years earlier, fleeing memories of the war and a family tragedy that had hollowed him out. He'd built his small ranch with his own 2 hands, 20 acres, 37 head of cattle, and a reputation for being as unapproachable as the mountain peaks that surrounded his land. The locals in the nearby settlement of Pine Creek had taken to calling him the Ghost for his tendency to appear in town only when absolutely necessary, speaking little and leaving quickly. The frontier's no place for sentiment, he often told himself. Out here, a man stands alone or he falls. This belief had hardened into certainty after watching his older brother bleed out from a gunshot wound during a cattle raid 2 years earlier. The loss had sealed Zane into a fortress of solitude, his athletic frame and striking blue eyes hidden beneath the wide brim of his hat whenever he ventured into town. What Zane wanted was simple: to be left alone to tend his herd, expand his modest holdings, and make it through each season without the complications that came from relying on others. What he failed to recognize was the gnawing emptiness that woke him in the cold hours before dawn, the yearning for a voice other than his own to fill the silence of his 4 walls. The first basket appeared on a Tuesday morning in early April. Zane had risen before dawn as usual, pulling on his worn denim pants and cotton shirt before stepping out to check on a pregnant heifer. There on his porch sat a covered wicker basket, steam still rising from beneath the checkered cloth that covered it. Zane froze, hand instinctively moving to the revolver on his hip. He scanned the tree line, the rolling hills, finding nothing but the pink-gold light of dawn stretching across his land. Rusty sniffed at the basket, tail wagging, no sense of danger. Cautiously, Zane knelt and pulled back the cloth. Inside sat a loaf of fresh bread, still warm from the oven, alongside a jar of preserves and what appeared to be venison stew in a sealed container. No note, no explanation. "What in the hell?" he muttered, peering again at the surrounding landscape. Someone had approached his cabin in the dead of night, left food, and disappeared without a trace. The thought unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Zane considered discarding the food, suspicious of any unsolicited kindness. But practical frontier sense prevailed. Wasting good food was a luxury no rancher could afford. That evening, he ate the stew, which turned out to be the most flavorful meal he'd had in months, possibly years. 3 days later, another basket appeared. This time, there were biscuits, dried apple slices, and a small pie that smelled of cinnamon and cloves. Again, no note, no clue as to the benefactor. By the 5th basket, Zane had begun to wait for them, rising earlier than usual, hoping to catch whoever was leaving these mysterious gifts. But his visitor was like a shadow, coming and going without a trace. The food continued to appear, sometimes simple fare, sometimes elaborate treats that spoke of considerable cooking skill. One morning in late April, Zane found not only food but also a small bundle of wildflowers tied with a blue ribbon. Something about those flowers, simple prairie blooms gathered with care, stirred something in him he thought long dead. He placed them in a jar on his table, feeling foolish but unwilling to discard them. Pine Creek was little more than a collection of wooden buildings strung along a dusty main street. A general store, a saloon, a small church, and various businesses catering to the needs of the surrounding homesteads and ranches. Zane rode into town on the first Saturday in May, his list of supplies tucked into his shirt pocket. He'd begun to take slightly more care with his appearance, trimming his light stubble and wearing his newer shirt rather than the patched one he typically saved for town visits. The general store was busier than usual. Homesteaders stocking up after the harsh winter had depleted their supplies. As Zane waited his turn at the counter, the bell above the door jingled, and a collective hush fell over the store. He turned, curiosity overcoming his usual disinterest in the comings and goings of others. A young woman stood in the doorway, the spring sunlight creating a halo around her slender figure. She couldn't have been more than 22, with rich chestnut hair partially tucked beneath a modest bonnet, and a blue calico dress that matched the color of the clear Montana sky. Her features were delicate but determined, with an intelligence in her hazel eyes that suggested both education and frontier practicality. "Miss Penelope, good to see you," called Mr. Harrison from behind the counter, his voice unusually warm. "Your order came in on yesterday's supply wagon." The woman, Penelope, smiled, and something about that smile caused Zane's chest to tighten inexplicably. "Thank you, Mr. Harrison. I hope it wasn't too much trouble." "Nothing's too much trouble for our town's newest teacher," Harrison replied with a grandfatherly grin. Zane watched as Penelope moved through the store, nodding politely to the other customers. When her eyes met his, there was a flicker of, what was it? Recognition? Interest? It disappeared so quickly he convinced himself he'd imagined it. His mind was still on that brief exchange when he rode home, supplies packed behind his saddle. "Penelope," he said aloud, testing the name in the empty space of the plains. Rusty, trotting alongside his horse, looked up at the sound. The next morning, another basket appeared on his porch. This time, there was a note tucked beneath the napkin covering a loaf of fresh bread. "Even the strongest need sustenance." P, just an initial. But it was enough to set Zane's mind racing, connecting the elegant handwriting with the woman from the store. Penelope, the new schoolteacher. But why would she be leaving food at his door? He had no connection to her, had never spoken a word to her. The mystery deepened even as it began to unravel. Curiosity, a sensation Zane had nearly forgotten, propelled him back to town the following day. He positioned himself across from the small schoolhouse, watching from horseback as children filed out at the end of the day. Penelope stood in the doorway, her chestnut hair now braided and hanging over one shoulder, her blue dress replaced by a simpler brown one with a white collar. She said goodbye to each child by name, her smile warm and genuine. When the last child had departed, Penelope remained on the steps, looking directly at Zane across the street. Caught, he considered riding away, but something in her steady gaze held him in place. She descended the steps and crossed the dusty road, approaching him with a confidence that belied her delicate appearance. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, looking up at him with those clear hazel eyes. "I wondered when curiosity might bring you to town." Zane removed his hat, a courtesy he hadn't extended to anyone in longer than he could remember. "Miss Caldwell." Penelope Caldwell. She didn't offer her hand, seeming to understand instinctively that he might not take it. "I imagine you have questions about the baskets." "Why?" The single word contained all his confusion. Penelope's expression softened. "Because everyone deserves kindness, Mr. Whitfield. Even those who believe they don't." Before he could respond, she turned and walked back toward the schoolhouse, leaving Zane more unsettled than he'd been in years. That night, he barely slept, his mind filled with questions about the mysterious Penelope Caldwell and the certainty that she knew more about him than he did about her. The baskets continued to appear, now with occasional notes, observations about the changing season, a comment about the weather, never anything too personal, but always signed with that elegant P. Despite his determination to maintain his isolation, Zane found himself looking forward to these small communications. He began to leave responses, awkward at first, mere thank you notes, but gradually evolving into actual thoughts and observations of his own. One rainy morning in late May, Zane found himself waiting on his porch before dawn, determined to catch Penelope in the act. The sky had barely begun to lighten when he saw a figure approaching through the mist, a basket in hand. Penelope wore a dark cloak against the rain, her face partially obscured by its hood. She stopped short when she saw him, clearly surprised to find him waiting. For a long moment, they simply regarded each other across the yard, the rain falling steadily between them. "You're up early, Mr. Whitfield," she finally said, her voice carrying clearly despite the rain. "As are you, Miss Caldwell." He stood and descended the porch steps, closing the distance between them. "You've been very generous. I'd like to know why." Penelope hesitated, then extended the basket toward him. "I heard stories when I arrived in Pine Creek, about a man who lost his brother, who shut himself away from the world." Her direct gaze challenged him. I know what grief can do to a person, Mr. Whitfield. My father never recovered from losing my mother. He simply faded away, a little more each day, until there was nothing left but a shell. Zane took the basket, his fingers brushing hers momentarily. So this is charity? No, she replied firmly. This is one human being reaching out to another. Nothing more, nothing less. And what do you want in return, Miss Caldwell? A small smile touched her lips. Nothing you're not willing to give, Mr. Whitfield. Perhaps conversation, eventually. Or simply the knowledge that you're eating well. The rain had begun to soak through her cloak, and without thinking, Zane gestured toward his cabin. Would you like to come in? At least until the rain lets up. Surprise flashed across her face, followed by a warmth that seemed to push back the dreary morning. I would, thank you. That morning marked a turning point. Seated at his rough-hewn table, steam rising from cups of coffee, they talked. Penelope spoke of growing up in Boston, losing her mother to influenza, watching her professor father retreat into his books and away from the world. She spoke of her decision to come west after his death, drawn by the promise of a teaching position and the chance to start anew. Zane found himself sharing more than he had intended, about his childhood in Missouri, about the war that had taken his father, about coming west with his brother Thomas and the cattle raid that had left him alone in the world. Penelope listened without judgment, her eyes reflecting understanding rather than pity. As the rain subsided, she rose to leave, duty calling her back to the schoolhouse. Will you continue with the baskets? Zane asked, surprising himself with the question. Would you like me to? He nodded, unable to articulate the comfort he'd found in those small gestures of care. Then I will, she said simply. But perhaps next time, you might join me for supper in town. Mrs. Lawson at the boarding house sets a good table. Zane hesitated only briefly before nodding. I'd like that. The weeks that followed brought a gradual thawing that mirrored the spring landscape. Zane began to venture into town more frequently, sometimes stopping by the schoolhouse to walk Penelope to the boarding house where she lived. Their conversations ranged widely. She was well-read and opinionated, challenging his views on everything from politics to poetry. He found himself looking forward to their debates as much as to the quiet moments when words weren't necessary. The people of Pine Creek watched this development with a mixture of surprise and approval. The ghost was becoming human again, they said. Some credited the young schoolteacher with performing a minor miracle. One evening in early June, Zane invited Penelope to his ranch for supper, the first time he'd willingly opened his home to another person since Thomas's death. He spent the day cleaning, self-conscious about the Spartan nature of his cabin. He even placed wildflowers in a jar on the table, remembering the first bouquet she had left him. Penelope arrived on horseback, her riding habit practical but feminine, her hair coming loose from its pins after the journey. Something about seeing her approach his cabin, silhouetted against the setting sun, struck Zane with unexpected force, as if he were seeing a future he hadn't dared imagine suddenly taking shape before him. Your land is beautiful, she said as he helped her down from her horse. I can see why you chose this place. It was Thomas who chose it, Zane admitted, leading her toward the cabin. He had the vision. I just had the stubbornness to stay after he was gone. The evening passed pleasantly, with Zane surprising himself by preparing a decent meal, skills learned from necessity rather than passion. After they ate, he showed her around the small ranch, pointing out improvements he planned to make, surprised by how easily he could imagine a future beyond mere survival. As twilight deepened, they stood on a rise overlooking the property, the first stars appearing in the eastern sky. Thank you, Zane said quietly, for not giving up on me. For the baskets. He gestured vaguely, encompassing everything that had changed. Penelope turned to face him, her expression serious in the fading light. There's something I need to tell you, Zane. Something I should have explained sooner. A chill ran through him, instinctive wariness returning. What is it? I knew your brother. Her words hung in the evening air between them. I met Thomas in Denver, before he came here with you. We were close for a time. Zane stepped back, confusion and the beginnings of anger stirring within him. You knew Thomas? All this time you've been, what? Watching over his brother out of some sense of obligation. No, Penelope said firmly, reaching for his arm. It wasn't like that. Yes, I knew him, but that's not why I came to Pine Creek. It was coincidence. I didn't know you were here until after I'd accepted the teaching position. But the baskets, the notes, were because I saw a man in pain, she interrupted. A man who reminded me of my father, withdrawing from the world. The connection to Thomas was complicated. We parted ways before he came here. It wasn't until I heard stories about the Whitfield brothers that I realized who you were. Zane pulled away from her touch, the walls he'd so carefully constructed beginning to rebuild themselves. So all of this, your interest, your kindness, it was about Thomas? At first, perhaps I was curious, Penelope admitted, her honesty cutting through his anger. But Zane, what's grown between us has nothing to do with Thomas. It's about you. The man you are, the man I've come to care for deeply. But the revelation had reopened wounds Zane thought were beginning to heal. He walked her back to her horse in silence, helped her mount, and watched her ride away with a heart that felt as though it were encased in ice once more. The baskets stopped appearing. June stretched into July, and Zane returned to his solitary existence, throwing himself into ranch work with a fervor that left him exhausted at day's end. But sleep offered little respite. His dreams were filled with Penelope's face, with her words, with the knowledge that she had known Thomas in a way Zane hadn't. In town, he avoided the main street, taking circuitous routes to the general store and stables to minimize the chance of encountering her. The townspeople noticed the change, the return of the ghost, but none dared comment to his face. It was Mrs. Lawson from the boarding house who finally cornered him outside the general store one scorching afternoon in late July. "That girl is fading away before our eyes," the older woman said without preamble, blocking his path to his horse. "Too proud to admit she's heartbroken, but we can all see it." Zane tried to step around her. "It's not my concern, Mrs. Lawson, isn't it?" The woman's weathered face hardened. "She told me what happened. About knowing your brother. You know what else she told me? That Thomas spoke of you constantly. That he wanted nothing more than for you to find happiness out here. That he worried about that wall you built around yourself even before he died." The words hit Zane like a physical blow. "Mrs. Lawson, she's leaving," the woman continued, relentless. "Got a letter offering a position back east. Says there's nothing keeping her here now. Stage leaves tomorrow morning." Zane stood frozen, the implications of Mrs. Lawson's words washing over him. Penelope leaving. The thought of Pine Creek, of his life, without her presence, even at a distance, suddenly seemed unbearable. "What would Thomas want for you?" Mrs. Lawson asked, her voice gentler now. "To live alone forever? Or to find what he always hoped you would?" That night, Zane sat before his fireplace, a letter in his hands. One he'd found among Thomas's things after his death, but had never fully read. He opened it now, recognizing his brother's confident handwriting. "Little brother," it began, "if you're reading this, something's gone wrong. The frontier's unforgiving that way. But here's what I want you to know. This land we've claimed, it's good land. Worth fighting for. Worth living for. But no man was meant to stand alone forever, especially not you. You've always felt things deeper than you let on. Don't let my passing be the excuse you use to shut yourself away from life. Find someone to share this dream with. Build something that outlasts us both." The words blurred as Zane's eyes filled with unexpected tears. In the morning, he rose before dawn, saddled his horse, and rode hard for town, a desperate plan forming in his mind. The stagecoach stood ready outside the hotel, luggage being loaded as the early morning light cast long shadows down the street. Zane dismounted, scanning the small crowd for Penelope. He found her standing slightly apart, a valise at her feet, her face pale but composed beneath her bonnet. "Penelope," he called, striding toward her with a determination that parted the small crowd of onlookers. She turned, surprise and wariness mingling in her expression. "Zane, what are you doing here?" He stopped before her, suddenly aware of the attention they were attracting, but beyond caring. "Don't go," he said simply. "Please." "Why should I stay?" There was hurt in her voice, but also a flicker of something else. Hope, perhaps. "Because I was wrong," Zane said, the words coming easier than he'd expected. "Because I let fear drive me away from the first good thing that's happened to me in years. Because," he took a deep breath, "because I love you." The words hung in the air between them, true and terrifying and liberating all at once. "Thomas would want us both to be happy," he continued, taking her hands in his. "And I'm only happy when I'm with you. These past weeks without you have been emptier than I ever thought possible. Tears welled in Penelope's eyes. "I never meant to hurt you," she whispered. "I should have told you sooner about knowing Thomas, but I was afraid." "It doesn't matter," Zane interrupted gently. "The past is the past. What matters is now. What matters is us." He squeezed her hands. "Stay, Penelope. Stay with me." A tear slipped down her cheek. "Are you certain? This isn't just a moment of panic at losing. I've never been more certain of anything," Zane assured her. "I love you. I want to build a life with you. If you'll have me." Her answer came not in words, but in action as she stepped forward into his embrace, her arms encircling his waist, her face pressed against his chest. The onlookers, Mrs. Lawson among them, broke into spontaneous applause, causing Penelope to laugh through her tears as Zane held her close. "Well," the stagecoach driver called with a grin, "should I take that valise off, then?" "Yes," Penelope called back, not looking away from Zane's face. "I'm staying. I'm home." In the months that followed, Pine Creek witnessed a transformation. Zane Whitfield, once known as the Ghost, became a regular presence in town, often seen with the schoolteacher on his arm. The cabin on his ranch expanded, gaining a proper bedroom, a larger kitchen, and eventually, a small room lined with bookshelves for Penelope's considerable collection. They were married that autumn, beneath the gold and crimson leaves of the cottonwood trees that lined the creek, giving the town its name. The entire settlement turned out for the occasion, watching as the once solitary rancher and the determined young teacher pledged their lives to each other. On their wedding night, as they lay entwined in the quiet darkness of their home, Penelope whispered, "Do you ever wonder what Thomas would think about us?" Zane brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch tender. "He'd be happy," he said with certainty. "He always said I needed someone to balance me out. Someone stubborn enough to challenge me. Someone stubborn enough to leave food at your door for weeks on end." Penelope teased, her fingers tracing patterns on his chest. "Exactly that kind of stubborn," Zane agreed, pulling her closer. "Thank you for not giving up on me." "I never will," she promised, pressing a kiss to his lips. "No matter how high those walls go up, I'll always find a way through." As winter descended on Montana territory, the Whitfield Ranch stood as a beacon of warmth against the snow-covered landscape. Inside, where once there had been only silence and regret, there was now laughter and conversation, the sharing of dreams and plans for the future. The scent of Penelope's bread often filled the cabin, a reminder of how their unusual courtship had begun. And in spring, when the wildflowers once more carpeted the prairie, Zane would gather bouquets to place on their table. A tradition begun with that first small bundle tied with a blue ribbon, a symbol of the love that had found its way through his defenses and into his once closed heart. By the following autumn, the sound of a baby's cry joined the symphony of their home, a daughter with her mother's hazel eyes and her father's stubborn chin. They named her Thomasina, in memory of the brother whose absence had once defined Zane's existence, but whose legacy now lived on in the family he had always hoped Zane would find. The baskets that had once been left on a lonely porch were now prepared together in their kitchen, often delivered to new settlers struggling to establish themselves in the harsh but beautiful Montana landscape. For Zane had learned what Penelope had always known, that even in the wildest places, human connection was not weakness but strength, and that opening one's heart, though frightening, was the bravest frontier to conquer of all.